Water,
Oh,
cran apple juice, anything.
no, I think we're okay, boy. You're coming in loud and clear, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
This is an interview with Clive Justice. The date's March 15th, 1994, and we're in Vancouver. Morning, Clive.
Morning.
Thank you very much for agreeing to take time to talk with me today about your life's work in landscape architecture. And I'd like to begin, if we could, please. You were born right here, right near here.
Well, I was born on Salt Spring Island,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the Gulf Islands, the largest of the Gulf Islands. Just across from here, you can't actually see the place from here, but almost right across the Strait of Georgia. High up against Vancouver Island is where the Gulf Islands were. And in 1926.
What was the actual date?
August 14th, 1926. Good year. 26 was a good year. Joseph Rock was in China collecting rhododendrons. The Queen was born that year.
Wow. An auspicious time.
Yeah. My wife was born that year too. She was born a little before me. So.
Definitely a good year.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went to school in Duncan?
No, well, we went to the first years. I went to the school that my mother had gone to as a child on Salt Spring. In Cushion Lake, and it was a one-room school. And then in 1937, when we moved to Crofton, which is on Vancouver Island, just across from Salt Spring, my dad got a job after he lost the farm on Salt Spring. He got a job managing a turkey ranch. And so we moved and we went another one-room school for last years of elementary school. And then I used to bike the 8 or 9 miles to Duncan High School. And then after 2 years, I guess we moved into Duncan. So I still had an 8-mile paper route, but still on my bike.
That's what kept you fit.
Yeah, it sure did.
And then once you graduated from high school, then you were with the Canadian Forces?
Yeah, well, prior to, even when I was in high school, we had what's called home defense, and of course Duncan was B Company, Canadian Scottish, A Company in Victoria, and that was our regiment on the island. And the Canadian Scottish, of course, was an Ottawa regiment, which I'm not quite sure how they moved it out, but I was joined up even then. We used to soldier, one night a week. And then after I graduated, I essentially went active, which you could do in those days, although they were trying to discourage it. And this was in 1943. Mm-hmm. And took training in Wetaskiwin.
Oh, yes.
Basic training. I was infantry. Actually, I was a machine gunner, but Wetaskiwin basic training, advanced training in Calgary, and then we took the battle school in Vernon, and then overseas.
And you were there until 1946?
Yeah, we were in Europe until 1946, Holland and then Western Germany. The big problem we were that year after the Canadians were supposedly being occupation troops, but the Canadians were quite unsuited to, according to the Brits anyway, quite unsuited to occupation duties. I ran a motion picture. I had a truck, a Jeep, and a generator, and I used to show movies to all the headquarters and all the units. I used to take once a week. I'd take it on the boat, and we'd go over to Borkum Island, which are these islands that are off Wilhelmshaven, or off Bremen actually, or Emmen, and they were resorts, and they were there was a whole bunch of Canadians guarding a whole bunch of Brits who were dismantling all these secret U-boat installations. I didn't know anything about them. All we did is I went over there, showed a movie, came back the next day on the boat. And I remember the movie we all showed because it was a two-reeler, and it was oh God, that horse movie.
Not Francis the Talking Mule.
No. This was a #1 movie with a little girl who later became a very famous actress.
How about
It's called
Scarlet Velvet? Red Velvet? Scarlet?
Yeah, that's what it was called.
What was it called? Scarlet Velvet? Or
Yeah, something
Velvet
like
No,
No.
Scarlet Velvet, I think, was it? I've never seen it, but it was Liz Taylor anyway.
Yeah, Elizabeth Taylor, and she was a little weak kid, and it was about a horse. Yeah, it was called. Anyway, I remember that because it was it was one of the ones we didn't get many Technicolor movies, but that was one. It was a real two-reeler, that one, because we showed anyway. Just and then so I had to find something to do, so. I did that until they sent us, till they decided we were quite unsuitable to look after.
Sorry.
Look after the.
It's got a big snap in my ear. I think okay.
Look after the welfare of the Germans.
So then something sparked an interest in you to study landscape architecture.
No, I'd always had this. Even before I went to Europe, I think I'd been interested in it. But when I visited my relatives in England, and it must have been I'd heard my grandmother talk about the landscape of England, and when I got to I went to see some of the relatives in in Somerset, Devon area. The countryside there, with the trees in the rolling hill, the downs, and the grass pasture land, and the hedgerows and everything. To me, I spent several leaves just going up and traveling through this. To me, this seemed to be the landscape that the world should be, the way the world should be. And I was quite serious about their idealist about this. And the other thing that affected me, I guess, we were billeted in the New Forest. We lived in the New Forest. They needed to hide us from the, so everything in England was dispersed. And we lived in there among this, and of course from the West Coast, this was called a forest, and it was full of beech trees and oak trees and rhododendrons all underneath it, see? Well, this was not a forest to us at all, or to me anyway. This was a park, like like the English idea. So, a forest was coniferous forest, like we had on Vancouver Island, and on like we're losing the last of if we don't stop it. Now, the true forest is, to me, was a coniferous forest, very rugged and very almost sublime, rather than picturesque, which is what the park is like, or what the English woodland is like. It's a woodland, but it certainly isn't a forest in my context. Anyway, and this had a great influence, and of course, I was very, very interested in plants and growing plants and things like that, and I didn't really realize that when I got to Cal, of course, you found out that I was at the one school where plants were of a minor consideration, and I'll get to a little later, in in landscape, although it had been founded in the horticultural, all of the schools of landscape architecture in U.S. had been founded in the horticultural tradition through agriculture, which is traditionally, historical. And so when I got back here, right up here to District Depot 11, and that's where Oak Ridge is now. It's just where they had the Army base, which they were determining and processing the Army. And most people don't realize that in the Army there's, one guy that's supposed to be fighting, and there's 5 guys administering all this whole situation. So anyway, they had a whole situation there where they were processing us, and you got month-for-month service. For every month you'd been in, you got a month's either in trade school or in university, if you had the qualifications, or in either that or you got a cash settlement, which my dad did. Because he was 40 or 40, more than 40 at the time. But let me see, where was I? Okay. We were being processed, and I was interested in landscape architecture. Now, I don't know how I had discovered this, but somewhere or other in England or somewhere I had discovered the word landscape architecture. And no one knew what I was talking about. Had no idea. So they shoved me off to old Buck out at UBC, he was a landscape architect, but they didn't teach it out at UBC. And they tried to divert me because there was no schools of landscape architecture in Canada. Okay, there was nothing. There was the School of Park Management in Niagara-on-the-Lake. They had that was there, but this is not what I wanted. I wanted landscape architecture. And luckily, they had all of the. And if it wasn't. The thing was, if it wasn't, and I guess I was adventurous enough, if it wasn't given anywhere, and they couldn't persuade you to go anywhere in Canada, you could go to a US or a UK university to take this course if it wasn't given in Canada. So I persisted. And I discovered the University of California and the University of the other school we always refer to as Harvard. The calendars for these universities, and I found landscape architecture at Berkeley. And so I applied with my high school graduation. I applied to enter the university. If you could, get applied, you would do it. They were still here in Vancouver. Still wouldn't have really. They were just trying to discourage you because they had to pay more. See, the Canadians were very, very. And if you think, that was the time of Mackenzie King, and if there was anybody who was tight. If there's anybody who was tight, it was the Canadian government at that time. And I didn't realize it till after how, what's the name? It's not acrimonious, sanctimonious, no, something. Parsimonious is the word. And that was the ultimate in the absolute ultimate in it. Well, anyway, they were reluctant if they could persuade you. So there were a lot of guys, but I was stubborn, I guess, in being from. And so they left it at that. I applied to go to University of California, and I think I even wrote to Harvard. Yes, I did. But they had a graduate program at the time, and later I found out, that Austin Floyd was there. He was the other veteran at the time who was older generation, but I didn't meet him till later. But he was from that other school. Of course, you got to remember that Berkeley was, and I didn't know this, Berkeley was the #1 school of landscape architecture in literally the world at this time, because that's where the whole modern landscape architectural movement was. See? And anyway, got over to the island, worked for my uncle, putting in lawns. Well, you had a nursery over there for the summer. The application came, acceptance, and of course, being from the island, being an islander, you see, you checked in at your DVA in Victoria, and I was Canadian, Scottish, and everything like that. So they transferred all my records over to Vancouver Island, and again, here they were very reluctant to let me do it until it got over to Vancouver Island, and the guy said, "You from the island?" I said, "Sure, I'm from the island. I was born here." He says, "You want to go to California? You're going." And so, because you got to remember how insular these places were, and of course, hopefully, we still are a little bit. And he says, "You're going. Those guys over there are not gonna, So I got to go. I arrived a little late, and I took landscape architecture, and at the time, of course, Bob Royston was my professor, and of course, Garrett Ekbo, and Thomas Church, and Williams, and all of the great Halpern. Halpern was away in Israel, I think, at the time. The great movement in design, landscape design, you see. And I ended up being the first Canadian to graduate from the University of California in Berkeley in landscape architecture. And then Jack Walker followed me, Vic Chinazik followed me. I don't know. And Roman Fodchuk. Them guys, see, I was the first, and I didn't know this. I had no idea. Mm-hmm. See, of course. And of course, when I graduated and got back to I became the assistant landscape architect with the Department of Public Works under Otis Bishoprick. Well, I was accepted in open arms because prior to graduation, old Stenson and Duddington Grubb had been on some kind of a tour. I don't know what these guys, I couldn't figure out. I guess it's all like all landscape architects. They love to tour. And they had run into me, see? And of course, the difference between East and West in Canada is so, in those days, was so bad, you wouldn't even know. And they just happened to luck in on it, I guess. I remember one of my classmates actually followed me. It was Rich Haig, and Rich has become the great guru of Northwest. Anyway, one of the reasons why, and of course, landscape architecture in California was quite unlike anything that I'd ever imagined landscape architecture was about. I remember old Vaughan, our professor, teaching us history of landscape architecture, and he had all these beautiful slides of all these Italian villas and French things, and he never once even mentioned the English landscape school, which now in hindsight you look at it. I traveled around the world, and the one thing that everybody has is the English landscape. You find up in the goddamn mountains in the Himalayas, and there it is. Weird as hell. Or Malaysia, or anywhere in the world. This whole thing. But at that time, you see, it was very regional in California, and they had come because of climate, via the long tradition of the Spanish or the Mediterranean influence in landscape. So, and they had evolved this, and the design of the modern, the modern landscape architectural movement was tied almost to modern art in the sense. And the greatest exponent, of course, was Roberto Burle Marx. And I didn't find out about him until after we graduated, but there was a great influence because I know Bob Royston and even Garrett Ekbo. And I remember the day we graduated, Garrett Ekbo's book came out on, what the hell is the name of it? And it was the first book in America written on landscape design. And it showed some of these mad things that he'd done, that Garrett had done.
That was 1950 then?
I graduated in 1950, and then we went for a year to Ottawa and ended up with Otis. And there was a great ferment at that time we were building, and we were doing military hospitals and post offices and a great building. And we also got to do good old 24 Sussex Street, which just was quite a political thing. And there's where you see it's a Westerner is one of the differences between this country. We could never convince Louis Saint Laurent. He had even though he was a marvelous gentleman, he had a peasant idea of landscape. It's come through the French-Canadian tradition. It wasn't Lenotre and all the French things, of course. It was not a product of French-Canadian because the French Canadians had been abandoned by the French. And so that whole tradition was considered. Anyway, it was quite funny, because he wanted to have a vegetable garden right next door to the French embassy. Now, the French embassy didn't have much of a landscape. I tell you, it was pretty crummy, if I remember rightly. You never mowed their lawn with their dam, because they either didn't have any money, I guess. That was the problem at that time. Anyway, he wanted to have he said, you have to have a kind of formal terrace, and we hauled in some big plane trees, I guess. Lindens from big trees from Sheridan Nurseries. I remember old Otis got some things, and anyway, we did the design. And we moved, and the guys at the National Capital Commission, there was Ned Wood and the other guy that, anyway, they got us some big Mugo pines to put in the front of the house. I think they may be still there in front of this old senator's house. And we did I remember Otis designed a nice, designed a very nice railing all the way along, because it's right on the cliff, in Ottawa. Anyway, and then our first son was born, and we couldn't hack the climate. Neither one or I could just. So I met Humphrey Carver, and he told us about this school of planning out of UBC. And so we went. So we decided to emigrate back to home, come home, see. So I got a summer job with the city of Vancouver, which was setting up a planning department, and we did traffic studies and set up the one-way street system. We did all kinds of funny things in Vancouver because everybody was scared, and we were, anyway, a couple of us. Anyway, I got a fellowship from Central Mortgage and Housing to take planning at UBC. And we started out, and there were 4 students started. There was myself, and Bill Patterson, and Gerard Ferry, and Gordon Arnott, the architect who I worked with in Saskatchewan for years. Over the years, we were very close friends. Who was, is a kind of pioneer in his own right. Gordon is in Regina and the university. Anyway, big struggle. I had a couple more kids. Good thing to have a wife, I tell you. Wanda always said. And then and of course, all during this, we'd been working at the city hall in the summers, you see. And so at that time, they'd set up the planning department. Before, it had been done by a kind of Harthan Bartholomew and Associates had done the plans for Vancouver, and they had a separate office, Town Planning Commission, kind of commission deal. That's another interesting story historically, because Frank Buck, the guy that was at UBC, he was on the first Town Planning Commission for Point Grey before it amalgamated with the University of, before it amalgamated in 1929 with Vancouver. Point Grey over there had a very enlightened program of, it's headed mostly by Frank, I think, in those days, and a very enlightened town planning thing. They'd done some quite interesting things, and now you're talking now about the 20s, a little before my time. Anyway, we graduated, and I had hopefully wanted, I guess, to slip into a job in the new planning department at UBC, at Vancouver, here in Vancouver, the planning department, which they'd all set out, and they'd imported this Englishman, which is what they did, because there were no Canadian planners. This Englishman, Sutton Brown, to be the head planner. Well, there was Gerard Ferry, and I applied. Gordon Arnott had gone to Alcan, and Bill Patterson got the job as planner for West Vancouver. Bill Patterson was a social worker. He'd come over as an English, not a war bride, but as an English. They come over as kids to escape the war. He and his brother. And he graduated and got this job. He spent most of his future after a few years for the United Nations on housing studies. He's retired now back in England. And then Gerard Ferry got the job because they needed a transportation planner, and he went on, and he's retired now, but he was the leading transportation planner. Gerard was. I didn't get a job because Sutton Brown said he didn't want a landscape architect planner. He wanted an economic planner or a zoning planner or these kind of things. See, so traditionally, of course, you know, the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects and Town Planners had been the 1922, I think, had been the thing when they founded it. Anyway, so I don't know how disappointed I was or not, but at the time, this crazy, mad Englishman was here in Vancouver, and I can't remember how the hell he found out about me. Desmond Muirhead was his name. And he had immigrated here. He'd been with the Royal Air Force, and he had started up a practice of landscape architecture. That is, with a guy by the name of Hans Fischer. He graduated in plant pathology, but he'd done his original work in engineering at Cambridge, I think. But he was an absolute genius on plants, and he was very interested in modern art. So he saw the need, and he was the first guy in Vancouver to go out and design a garden plan a garden, and charge for this, or try to charge for this.
Muirhead or Fisher?
That was Muirhead. I don't know what, old Hans Fischer, I think he ended up, I don't know, I never met him. Because when I came in 53, this was in 48, he'd started this business of doing landscape design. And of course, he was greatly influenced by the California school, because that was kind of, I guess, all the books. I can't remember how it got published, but I had the only set of slides of the California school, because we had to take a course, and because we're all veterans at Cal, we had to take a summer course where we went around and saw all these gardens in the Bay Area, and we analyzed them. Now, what we did is we organized it, because we were all veterans, see? And we had one guy, I was on drains and curbs. There was a guy that came in, and he drew a beautiful, he was marvelous guy, what the hell's his name? Drew up a plan of the garden just from walking around it. He had this ability. And so we had this big report, and each of us did the whole thing. Now, this was unheard of in a design school. And we did this whole thing, went around a bus for 2 weeks. We did this whole thing. And every day we would have, and somebody did the critical analysis of the garden. And so we had a little page on each garden, see? And somebody took slides. In those days, we took slides. And I had the only, and of course we all got a slide. And I had the only collection. So when we had the first CSLA, that's before I left in 1950, the CSLA, we had the conference in Deep River, and I think all of us got in the one room up there, and I showed these California slides. No, ones. In these California slides, and I was immediately made a member of CSLA. See, because I didn't know at the time, but I bested all these guys. I knew more than they'd ever even. Poor old Duddington Grubb, all these guys had been frying over there, and I was right in the center of this great movement, this post-war movement of modern landscape design, of outdoor living, and the whole thing that the California school represented.
I just wanted to ask.
So I guess this is one of the reasons why Desmond grabbed me. But he also, funny guy, he had, believing that landscapes had also been planning and planning consulting, he had somehow garnered the job of doing the doing the zoning plan and the land use plan for Richmond down here. Wow, this was right up my alley. So that's what I did the first year I was there. And of course, this became the whole secret of how we were able to develop landscape architecture, I guess, and the kind of concepts like the school park and park design and subdivisions in which to center the neighborhood idea, which was all we were all able to do in part, and then influence the whole, for what it's worth, I guess, the whole city of Richmond now was a result of our getting involved in this. Anyway, and Desmond had been doing a little bit. We did the tree planting for Kitimat, and that was the big new town, of course, that was going here at the time. You know, all done out in New York by Alcan. Boy, the big company town, you know. Boy, Stein, and what the hell is the other guy? That great. I got all their books anyway. And so we started out, and I got this job, so I said goodbye to planning and became a landscape architect, park planner. And we were the first firm to practice in Western Canada on a professional, what was defined in America, I guess in North American terms, you see. And the good old CSLA, they just didn't even recognize. The only reason that I was a member of the CSLA is because I'd pulled that one-upmanship on them, unbeknownst to them myself. They were so goddamn, it took us, I guess, took Jack Walker and I till we federalized the CSLA, you know, by the component organizations. That was Jack Walker's and my idea, I guess, more than anybody else. We were bound and determined because, you see, they were flying in the face. It was an Ontario organization, CSLA. And we were, it was a,
Very Eastern Center.
oh yeah, it was terrible. And for many years, there were people out here who they wouldn't even recognize as being, you know, talk about an old boys network. Christ, it's terrible. And so we broke it because landscape. You see, they didn't recognize landscape architecture or any profession is licensed provincially, and we couldn't get it because they considered Ontario is the center of the world. There's no kidding about this. It's just terrible. And we fought this. I can remember. And now I could understand a little bit about Quebec, although they were always off, as far as we were concerned, often left field somewhere, them guys. But I can remember they gave poor old Danny Matsushita a terrible time. You know, I used to write, he qualified in my office. He worked for me, and he went through the CSLA system. They did have a system. He's about the only guy that ever did. And then they sort of lost his things. Christ, this was enough for us. So when BCSLA, we formed our, you know, out here, we formed our own organization, and we got licensing before anybody else in Canada. And we did it. And they still didn't recognize this back in CSLA. I remember they were just, you know, they thought we were being some kind of fringe group out here.
Your machine, sir.
Oh boy.
And so the CSLA had a process that people could go through.
Yeah,
and they
but
still...
it never worked. And poor old Danny got screwed by the system. And then, so everybody ignored the CSLA. So there was all kinds of people out here who wouldn't have anything to do with it. Because when I engineered, I and a few others engineered this business of becoming component associations. of, we almost lost it here. BCSLA wouldn't, you know, because we had our own organization. BCSLA, I can remember John, Neil, and I fighting to get them to vote to join CSLA as a component organization, and almost lost it. You know, it was only through the power of persistence through a bunch of old clucks like John and I that we were able to it would be able to become a component organization of the CSLA.
What was
Things were so bloody bad.
What was your philosophy behind that idea of component associations?
Well, you have a national organization. It's quite common in many other professional societies, engineers, the rest of it. You license the practice of landscape architecture provincially, just like medicine, just like engineering, just like architecture. That's the way they writ the Constitution, okay? We ain't gonna change that yet. Maybe someday we will. Now, so a national organization can only be an umbrella group that says, well, a standard should be that you're a Canadian citizen, or you're you recognize, you know, spruce trees or something else like that. And it should be a cover group that communicates. And so we arrived at Jack, and I remember Jack, and he almost, again, I can't remember when the meeting was, but I don't think I've got a record of that. But we said, we'll change the constitution of CSLA. And I think Jack did most of the work. It's a little hazy now. I know I was bound and bloody determined that those guys in Ontario were not gonna, you know, pull it over us. And I got the respect. A lot of people didn't get the respect because we had a lot of people here who were not graduates from recognized schools, you see. Other than the other school, which wasn't then as good, Harvard is not. I had the qualifications, so I didn't realize it at the time, but I was the top man, see. Nobody could best me because I had all the qualifications, see. And so I guess that was part of one of the reasons why it happened, you see, because nobody could discredit me. See, they could discredit Desmond because Desmond had come back. A lot of people came through the back door in this, see. But I naively had gone a straight line and come out at the other end there, you know, with I'd gone to the right school. What do you call it?
Yeah.
Talk about, you know, the right school, and I had the right training, and I was in the right place. Yeah. It's weird. Anyway, so it was a long, hard struggle, and it was. We even had trouble here with the BCSLA and the recognition of people who had trained in Europe under different systems. You see, there was no standardized system of do it. And this is one of the reasons why I guess I ended up writing the examination that qualified the landscape architects in British Columbia, because we didn't have a school, you know, they never got around it, UBC. UBC is about the worst, you know. They are reluctant, you know, 20 years after the fact, they finally got into the business. And then they had the audacity, of course, to say, well, you know, from my standpoint, well, we're going to set standards now. And I said, horse manure, you're not going to set the standards. We've already set the standards. You guys can go on and be academic. That's fine with me. But the standards of practice are what we set under the BCSLA for landscape architecture in the province of British Columbia. If you guys want a copy, I remember Ontario wouldn't even recognize it. So that's not a licensing act. And so we just naively went on and we developed the whole examination system. I mean, and the guys wrote in my office. I qualified 13, I guess, no, 14, I guess, who went through the apprentice, so-called apprenticeship system, and then wrote the BCSLA examination. It was called pre-examination, and they went before the Board of Examiners and qualified landscape architects. And we did this where all the other guys were frigging around and trying to say, well, you've got to graduate from UBC. And we said, no. And then all of a sudden, the whole world turned. And it became irrelevant whether you were a graduate or not. If you could cut the mustard, you got, after we had isolated ourselves from the nursery industry and become very professional and down the straight line, and then it doesn't matter now.
What was
you
that?
realize that, don't you?
What was that cause? What?
The whole professional, anti-professional movement that happened with architects, engineers, the environmental movement.
And are you saying that's a recent phenomenon then, or?
Well, it happened in the 70s, yeah. The whole credibility of the professions. That's really what it is. Sorry, I'm blowing your ears out. The credibility of the professions became into question, right? And it didn't matter that you had become Simon Pure and everything else. That's not what the public, what was it? The protection of the profession was not the question. It was the public protection that was important, and the doctors and the engineers and the architects. And we luckily were just. Oh yeah.
Okay.
What were we doing? Let me get this straight now. I've lost the thread.
Okay,
Yeah, our only problem was that we should have been the leaders in the environmental movement, but there was too few of us, and were making a living, and we compromised. I can remember many times when we said, we want a woodland on the schools. We want to use the topography instead of filling in all the canyons over in the North Shore to make Little League ball diamonds. We should develop these canyons. And they said, no. People said, we want Little League ball diamonds. So we filled in all of the swamps and filled in all of the bad places where you couldn't build a house to make playing fields, and instead of preserving the swamps, whereas previously we had said, we need some swamps and some wetlands and everything else to teach our, to talk about the environment. They said, no, we don't want that. So we got run out of town on a rail for those kind of environmental things. And then all of a sudden, non-professionals became the environmental movement, with people like scientists, people like Rachel Carson, who started the whole environment. Stop, we're poisoning the world, which is what she did with Silent Spring. It's the one book that I give every year to the thing at UBC. I'm running out of first editions, though.
Do you think that landscape architects made a really major mistake in not being part of the environmental movement?
Well, there weren't enough of them. They didn't know. They just, a lot of people, it's a lost opportunity that they could have done. It's like the other thing that they should have ended up in the teams, being the managers of teams of when they have these integrated developments in the new towns and everything else. What happens is that because landscape architecture or landscape site was not considered as important as, you know, the whole Macarg concept of taking land and doing that. That's when the landscape architect should have been able to dictate to the rest of the people where the building should go and all this. Instead of what happens now, and it still happens, is what dictates is where the money is. And if the money's in the building, then that's where the money, that's where the guy that's running it, he, you know, is the architect or the engineer. If it happens to be that it's a site problem, you know, and the only time that we got to do this kind of thing, I was the team leader, and the thing was when we did the botanical gardens at UBC. And we were able to dictate what the building would be. Now, don't tell anybody, because it upsets the architects very greatly, including my brother, who was on that outfit that did it. So the building never did get built out at UBC, but I was able to coordinate all the other consultants on the development of the botanical gardens because it wasn't anybody else's. See, nobody could understand what we were doing, and you know, and you could do the engineers did. They knew drainage and all this kind of stuff and everything, and that's one of the few areas that we did it. I did a number of, I became the project coordinator in a number of areas. But the thing is, the landscape architects were not trained in this. The engineers were. Training of landscape architects were not in this kind of project coordination. And they were relegated to, you know, planting plans and things like that rather than site planning and these kind of things. Now, and I, of course, I had to learn business because when I was at Cal, of course, that was the epitome of the private practice thing. Everybody did their own thing. And when we cooperated, this was almost revolutionary at UBC, at Cal. You know, we acted like planners, which, you know, worked in teams. But a couple of times, because of the nature of the people, we were all older guys, and we were veterans. And if you want to get anything done, boy, you just got a team together and you did it. And that's how some of our projects we did at Cal. Now, this was quite unusual. So it shouldn't have been, because when it came to landscape architecture, that's really what it should be. Yeah. A team coordinated effort. And although this is a very hard sell in the individual, you know, thing. And that's what used to bore Desmond, too. He couldn't ever work in a team. So he got off after he got bored with things. He'd do something. He's a great starter and stuff. Marvelous influence. He used to inspire you. God. Fight him. I used to, you know, have to. Anyway, I never would have been able to start the business without Desmond, who did it. And in those days, of course, you could get into business. All you needed is a T-square in a room, and you were in business. And of course, you didn't realize how much more we knew than everybody else. You know, so we were able to literally dictate. We were able to dictate what landscape design was. Particularly, we were able to do this because nobody else knew what we were talking about.
And you had some credentials to
Well, yeah,
Right,
then
anyway.
it's just like going to the doctor and you say, well, the guy knows all there is to know about cancer. I'm not going to question him about anything. And this, of course, this all came to this crashing halt when the credibility of everybody was questioned. Only we didn't matter that much, so they never gave us the gears like they gave the engineers and the architects and the doctors and everybody else when they whole professional questioning all across North America, that happened. And nobody's written on this. I wish somebody would. I'm interested in the history of these kind of developments. You're in the middle of it and you don't realize it until you get out of it.
Yes.
And anyway, I think I don't know, I think I was pretty proud of being able to federalize and I was I guess the guy who got the Manitoba Association to connect the thin green line across Canada by getting a provincial association going there, which became the components. So the CSLA has always been a bit of a struggle. And I think it's partly to do with numbers and partly to do with the nature of the profession is so different aspects. And it's so, fragmented. Because of the tradition and background, I can remember a couple of guys in Saskatchewan who you see, they never recognized CSLA was very exclusive. And unless you were a graduate of an American school, because there was no Canadian schools, but they didn't mention that, you could not join CSLA. There was no way of going through. And Danny was the first guy, I think, to do that. There may have been a few other guys, but this raised our hackles out here. Now, I didn't do as much. I didn't care as much because I was already a member. See, I'd become a member. I was one of the boys, and I at the time probably didn't fight enough because I was a graduate. See, so I didn't have to worry. No, I remember there were a lot of guys, Harry, my partner, and Phil Tattersfield and all these guys who weren't from the school, weren't from university. Sure. Well, no, but in the end, it became irrelevant, and we had to persuade them to get in. And then there was this other movement, the Oregon School, which Cornelia was part of. Well, no, she wasn't. She was always from that other school. Boy, and it was resented. Really resented. See? But I was separate because I was from Cal. I didn't get involved in this thing. I wasn't from an Eastern school, see? Yeah, I got accepted. Nobody thought me because I guess I accepted everybody for what they were. They could perform, that was fine. I don't care where they came from.
What were some of the things that you feel were important markers? You mentioned the town of Richmond. What are some things that you feel that you've done that are significant markers in terms of Canadian landscape architecture?
University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. Yeah. We pioneered the moving of large trees there, I think, more, and creating instant, you build a $3 million. In those days, it was $3 million. Now it's a $30 million building, and you need a landscape. And we were able to follow on with the big building program at the university, and we did every one of the buildings and coordinated it into a overall landscape. And I remember having a knock-down, drag-out fight with those guys from Toronto who were the architects, and I just about told them to go anyway.
Now that's curious.
About their idea of landscape, and we diametrically opposed to the architectural landscape. Yeah, well, yeah.
Is that unusual that a company from Vancouver would be working on a project in Saskatchewan?
Well, you got to remember, you go from when we started in the 50s, you go from North Bay to Vancouver, and there was only one firm, and we were it right here in Kerrisdale. So the guys looked around. There was there's some in Toronto, and I remember the guy at the University of Saskatchewan was sick and tired of Toronto stuff, or at least he said, well, let's try. And so all of a sudden he found out there was us guys on the West Coast here. So he called us in, and I can remember Desmond and I we stayed in the Besborough, and the service was so goddamn slow that night that we ate. I must have ate a dozen hard rolls before the main course, so he never ate the main course. I can remember that on the Besborough Hotel. Yeah. And then we went and talked. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy. He was a mechanic, and he was in charge of buildings and grounds. And they had this great development project going ahead. And we did a lot of work in Saskatchewan. We did psychiatric hospitals, and we worked with Gordon Arnott. And with the other firm, which I'd gone to school with the guy, University of, and you see, we were the only firm. There wasn't anybody that could do what we could do. Now, there was a few firms starting up but that wasn't their bag. I mean,
and by the time they started,
you see, we always had the capacity. We always had the capacity to do the very large projects. I mean, I didn't realize it till I went on this Ukrainian thing, that these were a piece of cake for me. I could look at something like that and come up with a concept for it just like that. Now, I never realized this till I retired, that I had been so smart, okay, that I could take and look at the project like the new towns or like anything like that and say, okay, this is the way it's going to look. And I think it goes all the way back to England, the vision. I can get a vision of what the world should look like. And I guess that, when you look at it, and that's as good as you're going to get, because I never get confounded with with the complexity. When you think about it, it's complex as hell. But the complexity of the thing is never seemed to worry me, And the other thing is that we made damn sure that we knew more about the plants, or I did, more about the plants of Saskatchewan than anybody else. Although this they found in Saskatchewan, God, they found this so goddamn maddening. I remember 3 or 4 guys that come all the way from the goddamn West Coast. And we wanted to use native plants like Symphocarpus, like quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides, all these kinds of things. We wanted to use the native wood lily and all. God, we had a hell of a time with those guys. No, 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 none of this native stuff. I remember having a big fight with the Department of Agriculture guy in Saskatoon about the use of native plants. You know, they're weeds. See? And I said, that's what we want. They grow, they grow. We don't need somebody to prove that he can raise that bloody plant. We want the plant to grow regardless of neglect or whatever. See, anyway, so we did do things, and we used to chase around, and we were able to. One of the things about the University of Saskatchewan, we were able to use a whole lot of. For example, it was a whole orchard of crab apples. Some guy had done study on bearing apples, and he'd have all these apples out there. It must have been 150 of them or more. And we looked at it. We said, hey, we'll move all these trees in, put them around the buildings. See? Because they're fully grown and they flower and everything. We don't care if they have any apples on them or not. Maybe that's nice if they do. And they weren't any good, you see, for cod. This we did. We also went into the windbreaks out in the Sutherland end of it. We just had them take, and we had a great guy there. He had Dieter Mark. Now, the secret to any of these things is a guy like that. He was a German horticulturist come. Anyway, he knew how to move trees. He knew how to landscape. He knew how to these things. And without him, you wouldn't have been able to do what we said. So, you take this whole windbreak. And I can remember around the Cancer Institute, first Cancer Institute building at the University of campus. We moved a whole lot of Scotch pines. They were just beautiful around this building, yeah. And it kind of made an instant look like they'd been there for years. And you know what the University of Saskatchewan, we always just said, needs trees, plant trees. And so we'd go around and collect these trees out of the shelter belts. They had them because they were making the fields bigger, you see. And they'd had these shelter belts, and I guess they moved 1,000 trees. Must have done. And made the campus a livable environment, or
it's a wonderful campus.
Yeah, I think it must. It did, and we worked with Tommy Church on the Regina campus. We did Yorkton, psychiatric Yorkton. We did quite a number of things in Saskatchewan. Because at that time, all the landscape architects like Jack Walker and them guys were working for Wascana Center. Okay, we did a bit of work for Wascana. As a matter of fact, we did the great with Gordon. We did the big Tommy Douglas building. Which is where they the medical thing there. We did a couple of other things for Wascana. We won a couple of competitions there, which never got built. Funny, we always were able to win a competition in Saskatchewan, but we never won one here. And then the other thing, I think, is Centennial Square in Victoria. That's the first redevelopment project in Canada. Before anybody was doing it, Victoria decided, and it's kind of a cutesy pie. Well, what have we got here? See that bird? No, I haven't seen him. Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay.
Sorry.
Can I ask you, because you were educated in the United States and the philosophy there, and certainly in California, and as you mentioned, there was sort of a different approach in terms of the history of landscape architecture right from there, kind of probably into your classes. Do you feel that that influenced your work as a landscape architect in Canada? And a further part of that question is there Canadian landscape architecture? And if there is, what is it?
Oh boy. Okay. My interest in knowledge, the way I look at it from my standpoint, my interest in knowledge in plants, in my love of landscape or the land, I was able to incorporate into the kind of desert Mediterranean landscape or the very modern, informal design, very structural gardens that the California school has. They're quite structural, both not essentially what we were able to do. It was to use plants here in the Pacific Northwest. We use plants much more. But when we first started as a structural element, you see, at Cal, we used to do gardens, and we'd make instant gardens, and fences are quicker than hedges. Now, you can't grow a hedge like that out there unless you can put up a fence in a day, and that's what these things needed. So there was a great need for instant landscape, and so that's why structural gardens are perhaps, they become instant. Whereas with plants, you gotta wait until the plants grow. And at the time when we started, you couldn't buy plants. They were, you couldn't buy plants any bigger than a gallon can, because the idea in the nursery is to flog this stuff fast as possible. So everybody was growing. I can remember even in Saskatchewan, they'd sow plants that big, and you had to wait for it. The trees, they used to plant trees like that, you see. So I guess my influence was, we took the California idea and said, look, we're going to have to learn how to move trees, and we're going to have to create instant landscapes with plants. And this can do you can do it in a certain amount, do it. But you combine structural elements and the very, very modern layout, informal, strong pattern. That's really very, very strong pattern. No weak need or no formal axial things. I can remember, it's the one thing in the world I cannot abide is axial. Yeah. It's just, to me, is against all nature, because it doesn't occur in nature. There's bilateral things, but it sure doesn't occur in nature. And it's very, I think, in 1956, I got an opportunity to go back to the World's Fair in Brussels. And since we were guests of the president of CPR, because we'd done his garden, Grant McConaughey. So he said, come on, you guys, we're going over there to see the inaugural flight to Europe with CPR, because we're rather partial to CPR in this part of the world, but now called Canadian, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, I saw Versailles. We got on a tour of Versailles. Now, I saw Versailles. And immediately I saw that garden, I knew why there was a French Revolution. I had never before realized what the hell the French Revolution was all about until I saw that. And it was so, what do you call it? So arrogant, a garden. So arrogant a treatment of land and people in it. Everything in that garden, you know, is larger scale. All the statues are so that always people, and all you do is take pictures, and all the people look like little ants all around it. So the minute I knew, I said, that's why there's a French Revolution, because no Englishman, you know, nobody could put up with that kind of crap. And so that's right. And everybody thought I was kind of nutty when I, you know, when I came back and I'd talk about this. And then the other thing that really upset me about talking about Canadian landscape was the day I saw Lake Louise and the hotel there. And I was physically sick at what man had done to such a tremendous natural site in the way they did that hotel, the way they did the garden. Everything was just as if they dumped a pile of garbage into the most magnificent site in the world. They ruined it. To me, anyway, they had. And I was physically sick when I saw that. Now, you got to remember that we used to listen to music, dance music on the radio on Salt Spring Island on Saturday nights from high atop the Rocky Mountains of Lake Louise. And they'd play, I can't remember whether it was Guy Lombardo or... and so you get an image of this, and you think, how romantic. And it was the most god-awful, most under-romantic thing I'd ever seen in my life. One of the greatest disappointments. And how the goddamn CPR. I knew the CPR could ruin most things. But boy, they did it up proud on that. And so, those, you know, that, anyway. It's funny, I haven't thought about that for a long time, but I can remember. That's the year, I think, I was president of the CSLA. We went and had this thing at Banff. The other great disappointment was the great moments in art school that the Calgarians had put into the woodland in Banff. It's the most atrocious collection of buildings I'd ever seen in my life. And how to cite them in the... It was just atrocious. And for an art school to do that kind of thing was just awful. I can remember going and ranting and raving. Everybody thought I was mad, but I'm convinced I was right. You know, it was done expediency. I think some guy gave some money, you know, well-intentioned.
Eric Harvey, I think, is his name.
Christ.
Well, are you saying that there's not a good Canadian landscape architecture, or how do you...
Yeah, leave it alone.
So the good Canadian landscape architecture is the natural
The
environment?
management and maintenance of quite a bit of the natural environment, particularly we're talking about the West, and also the prairie. Yeah, we have destroyed much more of our landscape than we've created. By far. Because what we did at University of Saskatchewan, we created the best English landscape in Canada. And as somebody else said that, I didn't do it. Which is not Canadian landscape. We created a campus landscape, which is what everybody thought a campus should be like. It comes from this long tradition, see? And so the English landscape belongs with the campuses of universities. And you can go around the world and you'll find exactly the same thing. The ones that kind of blow you are the ones that don't work. But that's the concept or the idea of it, no matter where you are.
But is that Canadian?
Even in India, Christ.
Is that Canadian landscape architecture then, though, if it's, an English model?
No, it probably isn't. It's the use of Canadian. No, but we set up a university in a place like that, okay, under the Anglo-Saxon traditions, and you build a buildings in that kind of tradition. What else are you going to do? And here on the coast, we have a landscape which is, has water and everything, a natural landscape which is a bit like the English landscape, but naturally just comes with the territory. And now you're talking about two different things when landscape. Urban landscape is quite a different thing, where you have to try and bring the environment to make the urban environment livable. You need the nature. And this is exemplified most often in trees in the urban forest, which is parkland of trees, because trees are the only things that count scale-wise with our urban environment. The only thing that can mitigate at least, okay? So this is one of the reasons why that's what I'm concerned about now, is urban forestry and planting trees and in the urban environment, and encouraging children to do this too.
But that's kind of the basis of my question. I'm trying to get at, is there a Canadian design that's reflected in our urban and rural, if it so happened, landscapes? Is there something that you've done as a Canadian, even though you were educated in the United States, that makes what you've done Canadian?
Yeah, the use of I can remember when Garrett Ekbo came up here. He said, "This is the jungle." He says, "I can't stay up here. I'm going to get covered over with plants." Because the California school, they used to use, 3 plants or 5 plants in the whole garden. That was the idea, and all the rest was structure and pools and everything else. And landscape was created like a picture, drawn like an art or a painting in 3 dimensions, you see, or a sculptural effort. But plants were only a part of it. What I did, I think, is we brought the great English love, or the great Northwest tradition of the use of trees of every shape, size, and it's a Japanese tradition also, English tradition as well, is part of the landscape. So we would use many more trees than other people would use, forests, and I guess that's my response to this garden here. There are 30 trees in this garden. It's a very small lot. Now, maybe there's a problem, but I'm just saying that in Vancouver, the tradition is this is why we're concerned about these damn houses. They chop down the trees because you can't develop, you can't recover 35 years. You just can't recover that. So if you cut down a tree that's 35 years old, you're never going to get it back. Mm-hmm. It's like gone, period. So I guess it's no great shakes in design from the standpoint of what you'd think about, but the planting of trees or the development of a treed environment is I guess what's the tradition here. Now of course, you got to remember that Vancouver has has an original English tradition, and the tradition is and the Englishmen are the people who went around the world planting trees, and so we inherited this in Vancouver, this love of trees and the diversity, collections of trees and everything. So we have great collections of trees here in Vancouver, just like the Pacific Northwest generally. It's part of our tradition. And so, and I, for one, want to, and you can argue it's not Canadian. It's English, because we share a climate. See, we share a climate and that's more important, I think, is where you share climates is where you get a link or a connection. And of course, the great garden landscape tradition is English. And it has been exported all over the world. I can take you to places in China and take a photograph, and even in Japan, where you think, well, hell, they never even heard of anybody like that. But, and you got, Australia and New Zealand and India and Malaysia and the whole bloody world. The only place you really, well, you do, even in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Only it isn't, they're doing their own thing, a little bit Polish, those guys, but anyway.
Can I ask you a couple of questions? We're sort of, I want to get this before we run out of tape here.
Oh, you only got, okay. Yeah.
What, just to do some crystal ball gazing, if we could, what are your ideas as to where the profession of landscape architecture is going, or could go, or should go?
Well, I think what has happened is it's diversified unbelievably. For example, in our practice, we did everything. I can show you a list of everything from cemeteries to guest ranches to dude ranches to hotels, anything we did. But I think no longer are able to do that. So they're turning out people who are specialized in the regional landscape idea, in the private practice of doing planting plans for urban environments, for townhouses, row houses, this kind of bread and butter kind of thing. And the big lack is there's nobody writing on landscape here. No Canadians. That's what the women should be doing. They should be writing on landscape instead of. And of course, the main thing that might save landscape architecture is the fact that it's almost equal. It shouldn't be dominated by women, but it's now an equal thing, I think, with women. And I found that in qualifying women and men, that women bring a special quality to landscape architecture. It's always been recognized anyway through the Americans and through Sylvia Crow, Beatrice Ferrand, all these people who made, what's her name, the physiotherapist lady in England. She's a good writer. Nobody's writing here. Okay, get back to what you were. I got off the subject here. I think it's diversifying, and there are a lot of places where landscape architecture is just becoming part of everyday life. It's not going to be a dominant running the world, and I don't think anything is ever again, unless it's politics or the bottom line, which is the sad thing about things. But they will be, as they should. I don't think they miss becoming the team leaders when it comes to environment. I don't think it's somebody else now. And the landscape architects are would be part of the team, and they should be guardians of the landscape, of the traditions of the landscape, and then know how to think. And the one great thing we lack, of course, is the management, maintenance, or the stewardship of our environment. And we are not, that's where it all lies, I think. We've got to teach or develop. And there's no reason why the landscape architects can't do this. But it means an understanding of ecology, of urban ecology, which is what we got around here, as well as the natural ecology, and being able to adapt it. So you're getting into people who are who are landscape architects, and who are, say, people like urban foresters, which is just the people who are supposed to be looking after trees. But this stewardship, maintenance, management of the environment is decided. There ain't none of us, there ain't no, they ain't doing it. They design all these great environments, but nobody's looking after them. And this is the real thing. They go down the hill. We even found that in our own practice. We used to design playing fields and all these kinds of things that require maintenance and management. And they didn't want, nobody's willing to pay to, or look after it. Society is not, we haven't imbued society with this idea of managing their maintenance. They just let everything run down, and then we start over again. Big panic to save the, endangered species or the endangered whatever, instead of guarding what we have. I guess it's a natural thing we have of, I don't know, a natural, with all of us, lazy, I guess.
Should landscape architects actually be doing that, or should they be in positions of policy development where?
Well, they should be writing the programs. I really do on this, because they have they are theoretically have been trained to synthesize or to link all these things together and to come up with it's a design, management, maintenance, so wherever man gets in, that's a design. It doesn't mean that it looks like a funny thing on paper. And the design professions, of course, and this is not true, and this involves, of course, being able to communicate to other people in the written word, which up until now, very few of the design professions have really understood. They can't communicate with what now. Maybe with computers, they'll be able to. So there's a real